Welcome back to another reading of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Today's reading is Chapter 8, and it is titled Flight of the Fat Lady. In no time at all, defense against the dark arts had become most people's favorite class. Only Draco Malfoy and his gang of Slytherins had anything bad to say about Professor Lupin. "Look at the state of his robes," Malfoy would say in a loud whisper as Professor Lupin passed. "He dresses like our old house elf." But no one else cared that Professor Lupin's robes were patched and frayed. His next few lessons were just as interesting as the first. After Boggarts, they studied red caps, nasty little goblin-like creatures that lurked wherever they had been bloodshed, in the dungeons of castles and the potholes of deserted battlefields, waiting to bludgeon those who had gotten lost. From red caps they moved on to kappas, creepy water dwellers that looked like scaly monkeys with webbed hands itching to strangle unwitting waders in their ponds. Harry only wished he was as happy with some of his other classes. Worst of all was potions. Snape was in a particularly vindictive mood these days, and no one was in any doubt why. The story of the boggart assuming Snape's shape, and the way that Neville had dressed it in his grandmother's clothes, had traveled through the school like wildfire. Snape didn't seem to find it funny. His eyes flashed menacingly at the very mention of Professor Lupin's name, and he was bullying Neville worse than ever. Harry was also growing to dread the hours he spent in Professor Trelawney's stifling tower room, deciphering lopsided shapes and symbols, trying to ignore the way Professor Trelawney's enormous eyes filled with tears every time she looked at him. He couldn't like Professor Trelawney, even though she was treated with respect, bordering on reverence by many of the class. Pavarti Patel and Lavender Brown had taken to haunting Professor Trelawney's tower room at lunchtimes, and always returned with annoyingly superior looks on their faces, as though they knew things the others didn't. They had also started using hushed voices whenever they spoke to Harry, as though he were on his deathbed. Nobody really liked Care of Magical Creatures, which, after the action-packed first class, had become extremely dull. Hagrid seemed to have lost his confidence. They were now spending lesson after lesson learning how to look after flabberworms, which had to be some of the most boring creatures in existence. "Why would anyone bother looking after them?" said Ron, after yet another hour of poking shredded lettuce down the flabberworms' slimy throats. At the start of October, however, Harry had something else to occupy him, something so enjoyable it more than made up for his unsatisfactory classes. The Quidditch season was approaching, and Oliver Wood, captain of the Gryffindor team, called a meeting one Thursday evening to discuss tactics for the new season. There were 7 people on a Quidditch team, 3 chasers, whose job it was to score goals by putting the quaffle, a red soccer-sized ball, through one of the 50-foot high hoops at each end of the field. 2 beaters, who were equipped with heavy bats to repel the bludgers, 2 heavy black balls that zoomed around trying to attack the players, a keeper, who defended the goalposts, and the seeker, who had the hardest job of all, that of catching the golden snitch, a tiny winged walnut-sized ball whose capture ended the game and earned the seeker's team an extra 150 points. Oliver Wood was a burly 17-year-old, now in his 7th and final year at Hogwarts. There was a quiet sort of desperation in his voice as he addressed his 6 fellow team members in the chilly locker rooms on the edge of the darkening Quidditch field. "This is our last chance, my last chance, to win the Quidditch Cup," he told them, striding up and down in front of them. "I'll be leaving at the end of this year. I'll never get another shot at it. Gryffindor hasn't won for 7 years now. Okay, so we've had the worst luck in the world. Injuries, then the tournament getting called off last year." Wood swallowed, as though the memory still brought a lump to his throat. "But we also know we've got the best ruddy team in the school," he said, punching a fist into his other hand, the old manic glint back in his eye. We've got 3 superb chasers. Wood pointed at Alicia Spinnet, Angelina Johnson, and Katie Bell. We've got 2 unbeatable beaters. Stop it, Oliver, you're embarrassing us, said Fred and George, Weasley together, pretending to blush. And we've got a seeker who has never failed to win us a match. Wood rumbled, glaring at Harry with a kind of furious pride. And me, he added as an afterthought. We think you're very good too, Oliver, said George. Spanking good keeper, said Fred. The point is, Wood went on, resuming his pacing, the Quidditch Cup should have had our name on it these last 2 years. Ever since Harry joined the team, I thought the thing was in the bag, but we haven't got it, and this year's the last chance we'll get to finally see our name on the thing. Wood spoke so dejectedly that even Fred and George looked sympathetic. Oliver, this year's our year, said Fred. We'll do it, Oliver, said Angelina. Definitely, said Harry. Full of determination, the team started training sessions 3 evenings a week. The weather was getting colder and wetter, the nights darker, but no amount of mud, wind, or rain could tarnish Harry's wonderful vision of finally winning the huge silver Quidditch Cup. Harry returned to the Gryffindor common room one evening after training, cold and stiff, but pleased with the way practice had gone, to find the room buzzing excitedly. What's happened? He asked Ron and Hermione, who were sitting in 2 of the best chairs by the fireside and completing some star charts for astronomy. First Hogsmeade weekend, said Ron, pointing at a notice that had appeared on the battered old bulletin board. End of October, Halloween. Excellent, said Fred, who had followed Harry through the portrait hole. I need to visit Zonko's. I'm nearly out of stink pellets. Harry threw himself into a chair beside Ron as high spirits ebbing away. Hermione seemed to read his mind. Harry, I'm sure you'll be able to go next time, she said. They're bound to catch Black soon. He's been sighted once already. Black's not fool enough to try anything in Hogsmeade, said Ron. Ask McGonagall if you can go this time, Harry. The next one might not be for ages. Ron, said Hermione. Harry's supposed to stay in school. He can't be the only 3rd year left behind, said Ron. Ask McGonagall. Go on, Harry. Yeah, I think I will, said Harry, making up his mind. Hermione opened her mouth to argue, but at that moment Crookshanks leapt lightly onto her lap. A large dead spider was dangling from his mouth. Does he have to eat that in front of us? Said Ron, scowling. Clever, Crookshanks. Did you catch that all by yourself? Said Hermione. Crookshanks slowly chewed up the spider, his yellow eyes fixed insolently on Ron. Just keep him over there, that's all, said Ron irritably, turning back to his star chart. I've got Scabbers asleep in my bag. Harry yawned. He really wanted to go to bed, but he still had his own star chart to complete. He pulled his bag toward him, took out parchment, ink, and quill, and started work. You can copy mine if you like, said Ron, labeling his last star with a flourish and shoving the chart toward Harry. Hermione, who disapproved of copying, pursed her lips but didn't say anything. Crookshanks was still staring unblinkingly at Ron, flicking the end of his bushy tail. Then, without warning, he pounced. Oi! Ron roared, seizing his bag as Crookshanks sank 4 sets of claws deep inside it and began tearing ferociously. Get off, you stupid animal! Ron tried to pull the bag away from Crookshanks, but Crookshanks clung on, spitting and slashing. Ron, don't hurt him! Squealed Hermione. The whole common room was watching. Ron whirled the bag around, Crookshanks still clinging to it, and Scabbers came flying out of the top. Catch that cat! Ron yelled as Crookshanks freed himself from the remnants of the bag, sprang over the table and chased after the terrified Scabbers. George Weasley made a lunge for Crookshanks, but missed. Scabbers streaked through 20 pairs of legs and shot beneath an old chest of drawers. Crookshanks skidded to a halt, crouched low on his bandy legs, and started making furious swipes beneath it with his front paw. Ron and Hermione hurried over. Hermione grabbed Crookshanks around the middle and heaved him away. Ron threw himself onto his stomach and with great difficulty pulled Scabbers out by the tail. "Look at him!" he said furiously to Hermione, dangling Scabbers in front of her. "He's skin and bone! You keep that cat away from him." "Crookshanks doesn't understand it's wrong," said Hermione, her voice shaking. "All cats chase rats, Ron." "There's something funny about that animal," said Ron, who was trying to persuade a frantically wriggling Scabbers back into his pocket. "It heard me say that Scabbers was in my bag." "Oh, what rubbish," said Hermione impatiently. "Crookshanks could smell him, Ron. How else do you think?" "That cat's got it in for Scabbers," said Ron, ignoring the people around him, who were starting to giggle. "And Scabbers was here first, and he's ill." Ron marched through the common room and out of sight up the stairs to the boys' dormitories. Ron was still in a bad mood with Hermione next day. He barely talked to her all through herbology, even though he, Harry, and Hermione were working together on the same puffapod. "How's Scabbers?" Hermione asked timidly as they stripped fat pink pods from the plants and emptied the shining beans into a wooden pail. "He's hiding at the bottom of my bed shaking," said Ron angrily, missing the pail and scattering beans over the greenhouse floor. "Careful, Weasley, careful!" cried Professor Sprout as the beans burst into bloom before their very eyes. They had Transfiguration next. Harry, who had resolved to ask Professor McGonagall after the lesson whether he could go into Hogsmeade with the rest, joined the line outside the class trying to decide how he was going to argue his case. He was distracted, however, by a disturbance at the front of the line. Lavender Brown seemed to be crying. Bavardi had her arm around her and was explaining something to Seamus Finnegan and Dean Thomas, who were looking very serious. "What's the matter, Lavender?" said Hermione anxiously as she, Harry, and Ron went to join the group. "She got a letter from home this morning," Bavardi whispered. "It's her rabbit, Binky. He's been killed by a fox." "Oh," said Hermione. "I'm sorry, Lavender." "I should have known," said Lavender tragically. "You know what day it is." The 16th of October. That thing you're dreading, it will happen on the 16th of October, remember? She was right. The whole class was gathered around Lavender now. Seamus shook his head seriously. Hermione hesitated. Then she said, You were dreading Binky being killed by a fox?" "Well, not necessarily a fox," said Lavender, looking up at Hermione with streaming eyes. "But I was obviously dreading him dying, wasn't I?" "Oh," said Hermione. She paused again, then, "Was Binky an old rabbit?" No, sobbed Lavender. He was only a baby." Bavardi tightened her arm around Lavender's shoulders. "But then why would you dread him dying?" said Hermione. Bavardi glared at her. "Well, look at it logically," said Hermione, turning to the rest of the group. "I mean, Binky didn't even die today, did he? Lavender just got the news today." Lavender wailed loudly. "And she can't have been dreading it because it's come as a real shock." "Don't mind Hermione, Lavender," said Ron loudly. "She doesn't think other people's pets matter very much." Professor McGonagall opened the classroom door at that moment, which was perhaps lucky. Hermione and Ron were looking daggers at each other, and when they got into class, they seated themselves on either side of Harry and didn't talk to each other for the whole class. Harry still hadn't decided what he was going to say to Professor McGonagall when the bell rang at the end of the lesson. But it was she who brought up the subject of Hogsmeade first. "One moment, please," she called as the class made to leave. "As you're all in my house, you should hand Hogsmeade permission forms to me before Halloween. No form, no visiting the village, so don't forget." Neville put up his hand. "Please, Professor, I think I've lost." "Your grandmother sent yours to me directly, Longbottom," said Professor McGonagall. "She seemed to think it was safer. Well, that's all. You may leave." "Ask her now," Ron hissed at Harry. "Oh, but..." Hermione began. "Go for it, Harry," said Ron stubbornly. Harry waited for the rest of the class to disappear, then headed nervously for Professor McGonagall's desk. "Yes, Potter?" Harry took a deep breath. "Professor, my aunt and uncle forgot to sign my form," he said. Professor McGonagall looked over her square spectacles at him, but didn't say anything. "So, do you think it would be all right? I mean, will it be okay if I go to Hogsmeade?" Professor McGonagall looked down and began shuffling papers on her desk. "I'm afraid not, Potter," she said. "You heard what I said. No form, no visiting the village. That's the rule." "But, Professor, my aunt and uncle, they're muggles. They don't really understand about Hogwarts forms and stuff," Harry said, while Ron egged him on with vigorous nods. "If you said I could go—" "But I don't say so," said Professor McGonagall, standing up and piling her papers neatly into a drawer. "The form clearly states that the parent or guardian must give permission." She turned to look at him with an odd expression on her face. Was it pity? "I'm sorry, Potter, but that's my final word. You had better hurry or you'll be late for your next lesson."